Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell. You'll get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And when I'm not asking Bruce, hey, how big was Batista's? Well, you know. One of the things I like to do is help people save money. And if you're watching this video right now and you're in a 30-year loan, man, you're overpaying your single biggest bill and you may not even realize it. I want you to do a little experiment for me. Take your calculator out, multiply your monthly house payment by 360 payments. That's how many payments there are in a 30-year loan. That big scary number, that's your total of payments. You're looking at that number? You know you can do better. Keep more of your own money right now and go to savewithconrad.com. Or maybe you've got credit card debt. Man, it's not a matter of if I can save you money with that. Your average interest rate on a credit card is more than 20%. And by the way, all the interest you pay on those credit cards, it's not tax deductible. Whereas the mortgage interest, well, that is tax deductible. So if you owe this debt, it's up to you how to pay it back. Doesn't it make sense to get the cheapest rate possible and the greatest tax deduction possible? Find out how much money you can save right now for free at savewithconrad.com. You don't need perfect credit. Even scores in the 500s can be approved, and it's no cost out of pocket. But maybe best of all, we're licensed in more than 40 states. We can help more families than ever before. But how much can we save you? Find out right now for free with a quick quote from savewithconrad.com. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to Dark Side of the Podcast. Of course, you were probably expecting a little Grillin' JR content. That will be here tomorrow. But first, we wanted to talk about the tremendous new series that we've all enjoyed now for 2 complete seasons on Vice. Of course, we're talking about Dark Side of the Ring, and joining us today, as always, the creators of that show, Evan and Jason. Jason, how are you, man?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Man, I'm excited with what you guys have put together. The Owen Hart special was last night, Evan, and I got to tell you, man, this may have been the most emotional Dark Side of the Ring so far. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. I mean, I was sitting back watching it live on TV last night. I've seen this thing 100 times in every iteration of its edit. And even then, it still got to me. You know, it still got me during some of those really highly emotional moments. It's such a sad, devastating, and just aggravating story.
Yeah, I got to say, too, same thing. Like, we've been living in this story like all year pretty much. And just with, you know, the tone of the rest of the show, we're just kind of living in this tone. And last night I was just like I was skimming through actually YouTube and just watching people's live reactions to the show. And I couldn't see what they were seeing, but I could hear the show. And I know it so well from like editing it, but just seeing their reactions to it, I realized like, oh my God, like this is, you know, it's so much more powerful and such an intense story. It's just every time I see it or get a chance to see it, like through someone else's eyes, it's really eye-opening.
Evan, talk to us a little bit about how this became a topic you wanted to cover. You know, I'm always fascinated with you guys' process of, you know, a certain number of episodes have been quote unquote ordered, and we know that we've got a budget for this and we've got time for that. How did you decide on Owen, and more importantly, how in the world, I guess this is a 2-part question, did you get Martha to approve? Because the narrative on Martha, I feel like is very much changed. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a little later, but the thing that really stood out to me is the way most wrestling fans sort of perceived Martha maybe a week ago with maybe how they feel differently towards her today. And we'll table that piece of the conversation for later, but at least for now, A, when was it on your radar? I'd like to do this topic. And B, how in the world did you get Martha to agree?
Well, you know, this story is, you know, I mean, I was watching the Over the Edge pay-per-view when it happened back in 1999. And, you know, I remember all the feelings I was going through at the time. And then I definitely remember school the next day. And, you know, being there on recess and talking with everybody and mourning that. I mean, it was a huge deal to me as a kid. And I always looked up to Owen Hart because my dad's name is Owen. And so Owen Hart was the only other Owen that I had ever known. And so that was a really profoundly affecting thing for me as a kid. And, you know, flash forward to making this TV show, you know, once we kind of settled on the name Dark Side of the Ring and figured out that these were the kind of stories we were going to be telling, it's hard to ignore that, the Owen Hart story doesn't fit into that, mold. It was, I think, around season 2 when that was finishing, when season 1 was finishing its run on television. That was around the time of the 20th anniversary of Owen Hart's death.
Right.
Because it was right around in May of last year. And I have to be honest, even though that Owen's death affected me so much as a kid, all the way up until around that 20th anniversary time period, my knowledge of what took place that night on May 23rd, 1999 was pretty much what if you want to call it the WWE narrative, or like whatever the narrative, like the most like popular narrative has been, which is that this is just a freak accident. This whole thing that happened, it was just this fluke thing, and it was a tragedy, and and that was kind of the way that I had what I had known about it. But it wasn't really until the 20th anniversary of his death where journalists were going back and re-looking at the case and taking things from Martha's book. And there was a phenomenal, I have to give a shout out to this because it was phenomenal radio documentary put together by the Post Wrestling guys. They did a thing called I think Owen's Final Day. And that was just so eye-opening to me because I really feel like unless you were an extremely hardcore wrestling fan, or like you read the dirt sheets, or you picked up Martha's book and you read it, you probably weren't familiar with the nuances of what really happened going into that botched stunt and everything that led up to it. So it was just around last year, 2 things. One was we asked people on social media, hey, what episodes, what stories do you want us to cover? And Owen Hart was I think right up at the top of the list. It was neck and neck with the Chris Benoit story. And I actually remember feeling at the time, well, like, how are we going to do this? Like, typically when we do these stories, we don't like to just, open old wounds. We want to try and find some sort of, other angle, other perspective that, we can share. And with this story, as I was reading these anniversary articles and listening to these podcasts, and yours, Conrad, you did an amazing podcast with Jim Ross where he was kind of going back and you guys were reading from Martha's book. And that was really the first time I had heard, passages from her book. And then I, of course, bought it.
That was very inspirational.
Yeah. And then it was kind of like, oh my God, there is a whole other side of this story, which is completely way out of the mainstream, which is the story of, negligence and like gross negligence and also just this really like and all the nasty details of the aftermath and everything and how callous the industry is. It's a really, disturbing, horrible, emotional story. And that was kind of, and then after hearing that and then pairing, with what the kind of average wrestling fans' viewpoint is of Owen Hart in the Hall of Fame, and some of the other fans who even have this kind of vitriol for Martha and this, for whatever reason, and combining that, like to be able to show a completely different perspective and to see how people have looked at this story 20 years later. And it was really kind of a motivating force. Like for me, this whole time was like, people need to know kind of what really happened, because I don't think there's a lot of people like me, including myself at the time, who really didn't know.
It's really remarkable what you guys put together, but you couldn't really tell the story without Martha. I mean, I suppose you could, but to me, what you guys have done the best is really show sort of 2 sides of thing. What we're seeing on TV, what happens in the realm of the wrestling world versus the real person, and who better to really talk about that than his wife. Jason, how did you guys get Martha on board? Was this a difficult process? Did you guys have, we've often heard the old game of 6 degrees of separation of Kevin Bacon or whatever. And How did you get to Martha, and what was her appetite for doing something like this?
Well, right off the top, we knew there was no way we were going to be able to do the episode without her cooperation and her perspective. So, you know, it was in our best hopes that we hoped we were going to do the episode, but we knew there was a big chance that, it possibly couldn't happen if she didn't want to take part in it. So Evan, I believe you first reached out and wrote an email, and she actually wrote this like really thoughtful email back, basically with a list of questions that she had for us and what like our intentions were. Yeah. And so Evan did like a first pass of like answering those questions, and we just kind of went back and forth on it, and it was almost like creating this essay. And it was really amazing in a way, because it really gave us time in the midst of all the craziness of like preparing all the other episodes of the show to really focus on like what were our intentions with it, and what was the story we wanted to help tell, and what was our perspective on it. And so she had these really like smart, thoughtful questions, and it was really smart for her, because I think she's been, over the years, a lot of people have reached out about wanting to tell this story or do something about Owen Hart's story, and I know it can be tough to really understand like where are people's intentions, or how far do you go down those paths with those people before you really find out like what the true motives of it are. But it just like it really like it gave us like an opportunity to really like think about like how we wanted to go about telling it, and I think she like really appreciated like our perspective on it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say like her email to us was like, I think it was something like she was saying, I'm gonna be traveling for the next like 2 or 3 weeks, so don't rush your response. Really take your time to answer these 10 questions. And they were extremely well thought out, and really thoughtful, I also felt. And then it was kind of like, I just remember, Jason and I took turns like, answering these questions and really kind of delving deep and trying to figure out like what our own intentions were. Like, why did we want to tell the story? Why do we feel it was important? And then like at the end of it, we realized we had like a 2 or 3 page essay that we had turned into her. And her response was, really positive. And I think just like the next step was like, after she sort of saw where we were coming from, and, a little background on Jason and I, and the background on the company, and of course the show, because we had already done season 1. And that we felt it was the best next step was to meet. And so I actually flew out to Calgary with no cameras. It was just myself. And I went out there, and I had dinner with Martha and Oj, and it was just a blast. Like, we had like a really awesome time, and it was like just getting to know each other, and like as people, and talking about our families and everything, and I just remember being there, and then I think it was like a few hours into the meal where we started to really kind of talk about the episode and talk about the intentions. And I think that there was this, Martha's talked about it since, but I think there was like, where I just laid everything out on the table, and I just didn't want to hold anything back. Like, here's the honest situation. Like if we do this episode, this is what we're going to do. And I think she just really appreciated, the fact that we wanted to take this story and, take it head on. And, despite anything, if there was going to be any pushback or any consequences or anything like that, that we just wanted to tell her side of the story, because we really felt like it has been marginalized, or it's just not gotten out there, And so she was on board. And then right from there, we just began, making the final arrangements, and, scheduling interviews and getting other folks on board for the episode. And then it just all kind of was built around that. And then we were off to the races, and we came back to Calgary and filmed with her. And then Oj lives in London, so he flew into Toronto, and we filmed him there. And Martha came out for that, and it was great. And so we just built a really tight relationship with them. But I will say that there was basically no way in hell we would have done this episode without her. and her being a part of it. So there was always kind of like, if this doesn't happen, we're going to have to do something else, you know? And that was one of the main things we told her is like, we're not going to tell this story without you. And that's 100% true.
It's really difficult to even tell this story in the time frame that you guys were given. You know, I think a lot of, maybe a lot of folks who saw season 2 were perhaps a little spoiled by Benoit being a 2-parter. Because on the heels of that, you think, man, this Owen show, this could have been 2 or 3 episodes, but it's a real challenge, Jason. And I want you to talk to this for a bit. How do you fit the entire story inside of 45 minutes? I mean, you guys had to have a lot of meetings and strategies and a lot of thought put into how do we, cause we as wrestling fans, everyone listening to this, they know who Owen Hart is. They have an understanding of what happened that night, but we've got to explain who Owen was, who Jim Ross is, who all of these other characters sort of telling this story are very quickly, and then get to the story and then the aftermath. And you've got to do that in 40 some odd minutes. This leads to some really tough decisions about what makes the cut and what doesn't, right, Jason?
Yeah. Especially with this episode, you know, we have the luxury, I guess you could say, of seeing like, you know, the very first cuts of the episode when they're like, when our editor like strings out kind of like the rough cut of it. And, you know, this, like you said, this episode easily could have been like 2 or 3 episodes. And, you know, it is painful. Like they're like right up until just even like a few weeks ago, you know, there are scenes that like had to be lifted to make time for other things that are really important to get across in the story, you know. And there's like, there were like these moments like where, you know, you hear so many great stories about Owen Hart and his ribs and how he was like one of the best like ribbers there ever was. And those stories are just so endearing. And there's this great story that was in the cut that I loved about Owen in a match with D'Lo Brown. And he ends up like during the match, D'Lo is like really nervous, and D'Lo gets him like in a headlock, and Owen gets D'Lo in a headlock, and he's like, "Hey, look at your shoes." And he looks down and he sees that his like laces are undone, and they do another move, and Owen's like, "Look at the ref's shoes." And he looks over and the ref's shoes are unlaced. And like, it's just like this, such an endearing story of like how like Owen like really helped ease D'Lo Brown's like anxieties in the ring by doing like these little ribs among like, you know, a huge stadium filled with people with no one noticing. And it would just show like, just like how like confident he is like in his own abilities, but yet just so, like having so much like heart and love for like one of his peers as well too. And so like there's a lot of little moments like that, and then there's a lot of moments as well too, like during the day of, that I wish we could have included. And I think one thing I think in your podcast with JR, like it's really like comes across really well is like just the play-by-play of the day of. And I wish we had more time because there are some really fascinating details, I think, you know, just leading up to Owen like going up into like the rafters, and how, you know, he had to dress in a total disguise and like walk amongst like fans like in the arena to get to the place where he had to walk up to a ladder to like get to that spot. And it's just like we like film those scenes, but you know, and having to compress it down to like 45 minutes, it's just really tough to get, you know, what we need to have in there to get the full story across.
Yeah. And, you know, it's like you are, you know, beholden to the show that has been ordered, you know, by the network. Right. It's not like, you know, this is our YouTube channel and we can just be like, whatever, let's just do whatever we want. You know, this is what's been ordered. And, you know, every show has to be cut to the second. Every commercial break has to be, you know, exact. So
it's all like a puzzle in a way, because like it's crazy. Like you have like your acts, there's like 6 acts per episode, and each one you have like a certain time limit that you have before the commercial break kicks in. So you have to work all these beats and all these little nuanced like moments within these like act structures for television.
And where do you leave people, and then where does it come back in, and all that stuff. There's a whole kind of science to it. But you know, when we pitched season 2 originally, we had been working already months and months and months on the Chris Benoit episode, as we had explained on the first episode of this podcast. And so right then and there, we knew that, like, if we're going to do this story, like, it needs the 2 episodes. Back then, when we pitched this episode, the Owen Hart episode was like, had a major asterisk on it. We hadn't had any conversations with Martha Hart. We had no idea if this thing was ever going to happen. It was just here's a topic we could cover, subject to, getting access. So we just never knew. And then, of course, like, we didn't really know we were doing this episode until, honestly, December, so, so basically it was just like we were kind of fit into this box a little bit to do it in an hour. And also Martha, had been working for years on a feature-length documentary about Owen, which she has a social media account for, and she's been trying to raise financing, and there is so much to tell. There's so much more to talk about with Owen, and his background, and everything leading up until that, his rise to fame, and of course there's a lot more to get into with the aftermath of the story too. And so we also didn't want to cannibalize that opportunity, by being like, okay, now we're just gonna do this feature-length thing, and one thing too, because we always get the feedback, should have been 2 hours, like the Road Warriors should have been 3 hours, and it's kind of like one thing that's interesting to look at, and it kind of helps me even when we're making these episodes, and sometimes when I see the finished product, I kind of think, like, hindsight 2020. It's like I always go back to the Bruiser Brody story, where I feel like, since that was our pilot, our like original proof of concept, like that really is kind of what I feel like is like almost the best in terms of its structure, where we don't really get into the bio of a guy or of a girl or somebody, like of a main subject. We don't tell you, they were born on this day, and then they won the belt on this day, and those types of things. And I think anytime our show really goes into the bio side of a story, I almost feel like we're like giving people the impression that this is going to be that type of story, when that's not really what the show is to me.
Right.
Like, the show to me is looking at one specific event in the one specific human event in this world, and how it's affected the people involved, and also, like the blurred lines aspect of reality versus fiction. It's not necessarily meant to be, this biography of their life. Now, that being said, there definitely is the material to do a 2-episode thing on Owen, just talking about May 23rd, 1999, 100%. So it was really challenging for us, knowing that, this was only going to be a 45-minute thing. Martha has another project that she wants to do, and, that's awesome, because I think there should be more. Mm-hmm. So yeah, for us, it was just really tricky, because there's a lot of details, a lot of stories that we couldn't fit in. I remember up until the 11th hour, we left out the part about Max Mini, which is a part of the story that is befuddling.
Let's go ahead and talk about that, since you brought it up. I had it in my notes to bring up a little later, but this story really could have been even more tragic, and I don't think a ton of fans even know the backstory of that. Tell everybody what was originally proposed that night, Jason.
Oh, originally they were going to have a small person wrestler, goes by Max Mini, attached to Owen up on the rafters, and he would be descended with Owen into the ring together. And I didn't know that detail until I think it was your podcast. And that was just, man, just to hear that this could have been even more of a tragedy. It's just, it just adds to just how scary the whole thing is.
No doubt.
The idea that, there could have been twice the loss of life that night is just unbelievable. But before we talk about that night, let's sort of set the stage a little bit. One of the things that I appreciated was the honesty and candor from Jim Ross. And he says, mm-hmm. We gave Owen a bigger contract, and I'm not going to lie. He basically says, I'm not going to lie or bullshit you and say that had nothing to do with Montreal. Of course it did. But he brings up a great point that I really don't think a lot of fans, when they look back and they say, man, after the Montreal screw job, which you guys briefly touch on in this episode, why would Owen stick around Well, Owen, for better or worse, came to the company after Bret Hart was already established, and right or wrong, he was always going to be in Bret's shadow. And now with Bret with another company, well, this is an opportunity perhaps for Owen to sort of be his own man and be Owen Hart, not Bret's little brother. And of course he gets the big new contract, and we sort of set the stage for that. But then towards the end of the show, we sort of have a nice bookend where we hear from Chris Jericho, hey, what could have been? Yes, he may have become a little disillusioned in this crazy, more edgy adult version of wrestling. And maybe he sought refuge with the Blue Blazer character, but in just a few short years, Eddie Guerrero's going to be there. Chris Benoit's going to be there. Chris Jericho's going to be there. Kurt Angle's going to be there. The opportunities for Owen, I mean, through the roof. We have no idea what his career could have looked like with that version of WWE, right, Jason?
Oh, absolutely. You just see, like, we tried our best to just show you a glimpse of just like how talented he was, just like how naturally like gifted he was. And yeah, when you see that, like, during that time period in the later part of his career, they weren't like, I think like wrestling wasn't really like the wrestling aspect of wrestling, like wasn't necessarily very celebrated. And he had this gimmick with the blue blazer that was just kind of like, a silly gimmick that didn't really highlight his like abilities as, a wrestler. And just when you think about, guys like Benoit and Jericho and Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, like being in there, and you could just imagine, like, you can kind of like sit back and imagine like what those matches would have been like, and just how like, how much Owen could have like flourished like with those guys. And it just, it could have just, it could have led to a whole different like kind of era. I don't know. Yeah. It's just, you can dream about what could have been. And that's part of the, sad reality of it is like, man, there was just, just so much talent like lost.
I also think like Owen's style of wrestling, and like just the way that, he moved in the ring and he combined these different influences from all over the world. I think he really was kind of setting the stage for where wrestling would go in the ring. I mean, he was so pioneering in that sort of style that we see more commonplace today. That, and that's another thing that, Jericho talks about too, is just, he's so underrated in that way, like for really truly being this kind of hybrid of style and so versatile in terms of the different characters that he could play as well. Just truly one of the all-time greats.
Without question. And, we sort of counterbalance him as the wrestler with him as the father. And I think this episode does a great job of that. And to see and hear from his kids, especially Oj, who was a little older, and he had such a vivid memory of his last conversation with his dad, where he says, hey, I want you to take care of your mom, which seems like something that a lot of dads would, say to a little boy. But most of the time dad comes home, and dad didn't hear. And I think a lot of wrestling fans, maybe, I don't know, in the last decade or so, wondered, hey, will Oj sort of carry on the Hart wrestling family tradition like we've seen with TJ Wilson and so many others? And instead he opts for a different path, and is now a 28-year-old attorney in the UK. So a much different path, but his perspective of saying goodbye to his dad. And then on top of that, you sprinkle in Jim Ross saying, from Martha's perspective, her husband went to work in Kansas City and never came home. I think you guys did a fantastic job of combining sort of the in-ring wrestling persona that we fans knew and love, and give us a peek behind the curtain of the family dynamic as well, which is really who Owen was most of all, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that's always, what we want, or what we try to do with the show, right? With a lot of these episodes, we're trying to kind of give you both sides of this person. Cause I mean, there is something as wrestling fans, you you believe in the character so much and you love the character so much, and then you start to really believe this is the person. It's that kind of power of celebrity type thing. And especially when you're young, as a young wrestling fan, it's very impressionable. And with our show, we always just kind of want to highlight the families, because, in wrestling, there are a lot of there's a lot of consequences of the industry, right? And it's very difficult on families. We've known that for a while, just in terms of the travel schedule of a father or a mother being gone for so long and on the road, and separation from from their children, and also just all the injuries and sometimes even worse. And so for us, it's like those are the interviews that we really kind of cherish the most, are being able to talk to the family members who can kind of, provide a whole other perspective into who this individual really was. And, and that was a precedent for us that was like immediately established when we did do the Bruiser Brody episode, because, you have Brody, who was just this wild man, crazy persona in the ring, but was just still, dad and a family man at home. And so that to us is always really fascinating with any episode. But with this, it was so key because, obviously Oj hasn't really done an interview before telling his side of the story. And again, going into it, I really didn't know what to expect, but just to see like that he recalls that day so crystal clear,
right.
Even being a 7 or 8 year old, at the time, and just all that, like all the detail, and of course the home videos. Got to talk about the home videos, because that was another thing that we feel just so, thankful to Martha for allowing us to use that material, because it's really like it's tough to even imagine the episode without it. It's tough to imagine how you would get that impression of this family without that footage. And one of the interesting things is that you really see that it's mostly Owen that's filming a lot of that stuff too, because we actually sifted through hours and hours and hours of this home video footage. And it's interesting because, Jason, something you noticed, right, about that Owen was really, like, the reason he was filming this was...
Yeah, it seemed like to me, like there are times where you see him, like, he'll film into a mirror, and he'll like either talk to himself, but it felt like he was documenting all this stuff to show his children, like, later on in life. And like, I've gone through, so many hours of Owen's wrestling footage, and I've gone through so many hours of his, like, home life and his family life. And, he's such an inspiring wrestler, but I got to say, he's, like, even more of an inspiring father. Like, when you just see, like, how much attention he, like, gave to his kids, and just how he had this, like, very, like, childlike enthusiasm, and would just, like, I don't know, just, like, get on a level with his children in such a way that he had such a profound impact on him, that you could really see it today, that, like, he lives with them, like, to this day. And I can only think too that, like, all that footage that they did, like, documenting it, the story for them hasn't, or the documentation of their family life hasn't ended with Owen's death. It's like they've kept it going, and they're still a family, like, with Owen, which is really inspiring.
Let's move along and talk about the night. One of the things that really stood out about the story, that when Jim Ross and I covered it a year ago, that I didn't know before we recorded that podcast, and you were able to track him down, is the Jimmy Corderas version of the events that night, where even in his final moments, when Owen knows, I'm about to die, his last thing he does is try to give a heads up to someone else and try to help them and save them in their life. And it just speaks to his character, where as he's falling from the sky, he yells, "Look out," or "Move," or whatever it was, but he's trying to notify Jimmy Corderas, I'm coming, and this is not going to be good. How emotional was that to get that story from Jimmy? And then we see a very different side of Jim Cornette in this episode, where a lot of times we see a very animated, fired up, motivated, and angry Jim Cornette, and he does that better than anybody. but when he just shows you who he really is and is very touched by something and moved by something, Jim Cornette's testimony about Owen in that moment, gosh, it just leaped off the screen, didn't it, Evan?
Yeah, I remember that moment in the interview at that. I remember when he being in that room when he was being emotional, and there was a couple different times during that interview where he got emotional, and he being Jim Cornette. Yeah, just obviously, yeah, showing you a different side. And, Jim is just so passionate, and he loved Owen so much. I mean, I think, from being so close with him, from managing him and everything. But yeah, that whole aspect of the story of Owen shouting out just really goes to kind of, just like what you said, it goes to show you his character in that moment. And I think one of the things too is like, getting Jimmy Corderas to kind of explain that story. It's like, maybe it doesn't fully come across in the episode, but really, I mean, he was very close to being hit as well. I mean, he was very close. I mean, I think it's a matter of a foot, or maybe even less in terms of what could have been, an even greater tragedy. And, Jimmy, lives with that every day, and that was one thing I remember also filming that interview with Jimmy Corderas when we did that, is that this is, clearly something that's on his mind on a daily basis. And he is, I just remember him being he's still shook about it. And just thinking about, like, if I had moved this way differently in that one moment, how this would have changed. But he also thinks about it. He harbors guilt because of that, because he's thinking about himself, when there's somebody else. But it's this complicated thing for him that he has to live with that's very traumatic. I think there's a lot from this night because, I feel bad comparing the Chris Benoit story, but just because they're these momentous media stories, like some of the bigger crossover tragedies in wrestling.
Sure.
But because the Owen Hart story, I think, was live in front of an audience and everyone's part of the show and we're all witness to it, I think there's something in that night that is still unresolved for so many folks that participated in that show. There's so much, I think that there's so much PTSD, I think that goes into that, and it's witnessing that. And of course, I just think my heart just goes out to Jim Ross as well, because here's a guy that's got to stall on live TV, and I just can't imagine being in that position. And then, of course, when I think probably one of the more chilling aspects of the episode is when Martha explains that, the boards in the ring from Owen's fall, and how the wrestlers had to go and wrestle on that mat, knowing exactly what transpired in there just about an hour before. It's so tragic. That
piece of new information, because I mean, maybe I had read it before, but I'd clearly forgotten. But maybe I just didn't have the perspective at the time and I know you and I talked before this aired, and I remembered still to this day the full Jeff Jarrett promo that we get to see a clip of here, where he's supposed to be in character talking about his match and, I'm coming to get you, and, old school wrestler stuff. And he takes his glasses off, and through a broken voice, I mean, he's choked up, and you see Deborah in the background too, sort of reiterating, "Hey, Owen, we're praying for you. We're pulling for you." And I don't know, man, the shot that you guys got, the photograph of the broken boards where Owen fell and the blood there, because obviously the biggest debate that has been going for decades now and will always continue is, should they have continued the show? And of course, in hindsight, everyone realizes, no, they shouldn't have. And a lot of folks at the moment said, no, they shouldn't have, but for whatever reason they did. But I never really thought about guys who he had worked with for years and years and years, 10 years plus in some instances, now have to go out there and wrestle in the same spot where moments before their buddy died. But the broken board comment and revelation and the photograph, Lord, that just heavy stuff.
Well, I think also, like, the decision to if the show should go on, I mean, whether or not WWE felt like it was the right thing to do. The police should have stepped in and stopped that show immediately. I mean, that that should have been a decision well beyond WWE, because obviously
you always hear, like you said, Conrad, like those debates, like whether like it should have happened, like shouldn't have happened, or should they go along with it. But yeah, it's like it's so unbelievable that that they would go with that, along with that, when, like you said, Evan, it was like a crime, like it's a crime scene. Whether people could debate, whether they should have went along with the show, or Owen would have wanted the show to go on, it should have just stopped right there, because it was.
Well, listen, the whole Owen would have wanted the show to go on is bullshit. I mean, let's be clear about that. I think the real deal is, and I know that, boy, Twitter was rough last night, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but there was a lot of heat on Kevin Dunn because he's in Jim Ross's ear, and he's saying, you got to give an update. And Jim Ross says, well, I don't have the information. And Kevin Dunn apparently said, well, he's dead, and we're back in 10, 9, and gives him a countdown. And a lot of fans really took issue with that, and I think got after Kevin Dunn a little bit and thought, oh, you're cold and you're callous. But you have to appreciate the context of that, in that, and I'm not defending WWE here. I'm saying I was watching that pay-per-view live, and I don't know what the hell's going on. Like, there's supposed to be a match, and it looks like we're headed there, and then there's a bunch of crowd shots, and JR and Lawler are saying, hey, there's been an accident, and this is a real life situation. This is not a wrestling story or whatever. And then it becomes like, okay, well, what's happening? I mean, I think everybody wanted an update and wanted to know what was coming. And so just like if you were a broadcaster behind a news desk, you have to convey that news of what's happened. And I do think that Kevin Dunn is correct in wanting to update the audience who just knows, hey man, something bad happened, but we don't know what. We've got to hear what it is. And I appreciate that they had to convey it, but I think that a lot of folks online last night really took that as a way to sort of direct hate to Kevin Dunn, when Kevin Dunn, in my opinion, is clearly saying, hey, we got to let the fans know what's going on. Give them an update. What's your take on that, Evan? I mean, listen, we're going to talk about the evils of all of this eventually, but I'm saying in that very moment during a live broadcast, shouldn't you, don't you have an obligation to give some sort of update?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated situation. And I think the most important thing is that it's completely unprecedented, right? I mean, this has never happened. I don't even know if something like this has even happened outside of wrestling on live television before. Right. And so by every second that's unfolding on television, they're heading into uncharted territory.
Yes.
And it's like Jim Ross, goes from being, a he goes from being a wrestling commentator into being almost a war correspondent, in terms of, something going from here's your, wrestling entertainment show, and now I'm assuming a completely different role. I think, and then of course just the chaos that's going on backstage with production personnel, wrestlers, authorities, perhaps, in terms of what's unfolding. And I'm sure the lines of communication between everyone aren't crystal clear or perfect. And
how could they be? It's not like there was a fire drill for a situation like this. There's no practice, as you said. It's unprecedented. And by the way, the priority is not let's get the message out to the fans. The priority is let's preserve a man's life and do what we can to help save him. But along the way, we got to remember, hey, there's millions of people watching this, and we got to tell them what the fuck is going on.
Yeah. I mean, we can get into that as well too, about the emergency personnel, because there's an interesting story behind that too. But yeah, but just to be in Jim Ross's shoes in that moment, I mean, he's completely, obviously he never would have thought in his wildest dreams that he would have to essentially go completely off script and now, basically be the voice of, something so tragic. So he's put in a really difficult position, and obviously he does the best job he possibly can do. But, I think it's just again, it's such a complicated thing to pick apart because, they did make the decision for the show to go on. I believe that it was around 45-ish minutes from when the accident took place to when the announcement of his death, happened. So, he had to go again from being this news correspondent back to a wrestling commentator, and then, come back to the fans and update people on what really happened. And it's just, it's very bizarre. It's a very bizarre situation. And, I just really feel for JR because obviously, he's known Owen for so long and known the Hart family for so long. And then, to really have less than 10 seconds to really process the loss of your friend and travel buddy and everything. And, it's wow. Just, it's really, really, really wild, crazy.
Ultimately though, and I know we're going to talk more about this. The idea that Kevin Dunn is giving him a countdown. I mean, it's a live broadcast. I don't know what else he's supposed to do there, but let's talk about, the decision to continue the show. I feel like you pointed out very correctly, Jason, that this is something that shouldn't have been in the hands of WWE, that the authorities should have stopped this thing. And we know that didn't happen. And Evan, you said a moment ago that perhaps there was a story about the emergency personnel. I hope that you're not going to tell us that a lot of them assumed this was part of a quote unquote wrestling storyline.
Oh, well, there were, I believe, don't quote me because this is again from Martha's book, which I urge everyone to grab a copy of, Broken Hearts, if you want a more in depth on she lays out exactly what took place, that entire day. And it is thoroughly researched, and very, it's a terrifying, but very compelling read. And there's a whole moment, when, I believe that some of the emergency personnel that were there, a lot of them, were going to be used for an angle, that night. And it really was because I think they were going to do a spot with an ambulance. I can't remember exactly who it was, but when they got back to the backstage, there wasn't this, they really, they weren't loading him into, this ambulance and they're off to the hospital. They were waiting for more emergency responders to come to bring him to the hospital instead of using basically the quote unquote gimmick ones that were hired for an angle later on. And it really, I believe it was Dwayne Johnson who in that moment was basically yelling at folks being like, you got to get him out of here now. And he's talking to the emergency personnel that were, hired to be part of an angle for later that night. And I believe Dwayne hopped into the ambulance and really got these guys to drive him, which wasn't something that was happening ASAP. So again, just another head scratcher moment from that night.
The maybe the most chilling thing of this entire piece that you guys put together is that I assume it was in a garage. Martha has boxes and boxes of all the legal documents and all the court proceedings, and she's hung on to all that stuff. But when she reveals, this is the clip, and it's a sailboat clip that just took 6 pounds of pressure. And a lot of us who had done a little bit of research on this knew that was the case, but to see it in Martha's hands, my goodness, what a visual, right, Jason?
Yeah. It's literally when you see just like the size, you can see photos of it, but you don't really get a clear idea as to the size of the clip. But when she's holding it in her hand and you can see the size of it and how she's just easily able to just pull apart the mechanism with just 6 pounds of pressure. That's just really sobering. And, I know when we saw that was it just hit us all really hard. It was just so.
I held it. Yeah. I remember I held it and I took it and I just it didn't take much for me just to open it by just, pulling it, not even putting that much pressure on, just opening it, and it opened, yeah. And of course, when she told us that she had that, and it was kind of this uncomfortable conversation of like, well, if we were to show this, it really exemplifies kind of everything, when you see it. When you see it with your own eyes, and even if you don't really know a lot about rigging, or you don't know a lot about, obviously, and especially when you look at the other, descending drops that Owen did with that locking carabiner. I mean, that's like a no-brainer when you have somebody locked into something like that, that's what you use. And when I saw that, it was just, my jaw hit the floor. And one other little detail about that too, that was really chilling, and just really emotional for me, was that, when Martha led us down into her basement, and we went into that closet, that closet is not only home to the legal documents, but also, obviously, and also the clip and all the other evidence. But in that same room, she has his luggage from that trip, that still to this day remains unpacked, and is all in the back of that room. And that, I remember, to me, was really heavy.
Yeah. I mean, it's that stuff that, you gotta appreciate that lock, or sailboat clip, it changed not just the course of wrestling, forget all that, but her family and her life and her kids' lives forever. And she still got it. And it's just, my goodness, what a sight. And of course, the reason we've heard about this clip and this company that WWE wound up using is because apparently this was a company that was doing rigging for Sting and WCW, allegedly. And in a little bit of nominal research I did on this, I saw that Sting didn't want to cooperate with the investigation. He just didn't want to be involved. How deep down the rabbit hole did you guys get with the rigging company, Jason?
Well, I can't remember, Evan.
Yeah. Okay. The whole nuances of the rigging company and getting involved into this story is again something that was kind of a casualty of the runtime, but we tried to cover it as best as we could.
Sure.
But basically, what happened is, Martha goes to explain in the episode that this top AAA rigging company worked with Owen on the previous stunts that they had done. I think on Sunday Night Heat, the one you see where he comes down and it looks more, like he, when he's kind of descending above the crowd and everything that we show in the episode. And the way that it went down was essentially they had made this creative decision. And then you hear from Martha that, when she talks about getting his measurements, when you just had him, and, it shows you how kind of quickly this idea came together to have Owen descend, during the pay-per-view. And they basically wanted him to spring free immediately to be able to fight with the Godfather in that match, and not have to take, whatever 30 to 60 seconds it would take to unlock him from, the carabiner or whatever. So they were exploring these ideas, and they couldn't get riggers to really commit to that kind of a concept, just given, I think, the height in which we're talking about here. And so the very first rigging company, the original one that they hired, had basically told them, we can do it, but here's the estimate on cost. And then they felt that that was too expensive for what they wanted to do for the stunt. So they started investigating other folks that could do the stunt. And, Bobby Talbert and his crew essentially had assisted in part in some of the WCW Sting descents. However, during the lawsuit, when this whole thing went to trial, to the best of my knowledge, WWE couldn't find any, other rigging companies or anyone who's an expert in that field to really, co-sign the equipment that they were using, and Martha's team really had all of the professionals in this field to really, like, on her side, saying this whole thing was a complete botched disaster. And when, she had signed affidavits from that, his name escapes me, the guy who was the original rigger, who was, quote, too expensive at the time. He was basically saying that, it's an insult to say that this guy really helped in on the Sting descents. And this guy being Bobby Talbert, who would be one of the main guys involved with, Owen's stunt during the Over the Edge pay-per-view. And so I think he had like a very small role, but he wasn't really the guy hands-on in terms of, assisting Sting and doing this drop. And then what happened is after the WWE had approached Bobby Talbert and had, engaged him to do the stunt, the guys who had originally rigged Owen, I mean, this guy had a bad feeling about this. He was like, ugh, I don't feel good about what they're about to do and what they want to do. And he actually called the WWE back and was like, listen, like, I'll do it for the price you want me to do it, and just because I have a bad feeling about this, essentially. But at that point, they had already gone forward and engaged another team.
Oh man, just continues to unravel. One of the things that I didn't know, and again, this happened so long ago. Maybe I did read it somewhere along the way, but the idea that Vince called Martha and told her that, hey, there was an accident and he fell. I can't imagine what that call must have been like. But then there's a moment when Martha is trying to explain to you guys how she got a call from the doctor, and you could see she got upset for a minute and wanted to just sort of turn her head and regain her composure. She's so upset. She's trying to search for the words, and you guys left it all in. And it's one of the most emotional moments, I think, in the entire series between season 1 and season 2. Wouldn't you agree, Jason?
Yeah, I think for us, like those moments, especially that moment with Martha, is that you could just, I don't know, you just see like her bravery, like in that moment. And there are times in the episode and in the other episodes too, where we kind of linger in those moments a little bit. And I think we feel it's like really important for people to just see, how much these stories do really affect these people still to this day after, all this time. But I think it's inspiring for people to just see their bravery and working through those moments to continue talking about it. And with Martha, especially in that moment, you can see her take a moment, to reflect on it and, work through her emotions and then come back like just so strong. Those are really powerful moments for us, for sure.
Yeah. And I think also, one of the things too that's inspiring about Martha and her story is, when she talks about even that moment, getting the news, and that day that she was faced with this decision, where she sees there's one path of destruction and then there's another path, into reconstruction. And I think that's just super inspiring. I think, and the fact that, her family has been able to pick up and move on in ways and really, have strength in that is very inspiring, and something we also wanted to highlight because, she has done so much, with the Owen Hart Foundation and in her own career, and of course with Oge's career and now Athena's. And that is just really inspiring to me. And also, when there's that moment in the episode when she goes to view his body when it's finally come, back from the States. And she basically says that moment when, she realizes that, she wasn't afraid of, seeing him in this way anymore, because she realizes the person that she loved in life is, she also can love in death. And I think that's also just a really, for me personally, a very inspiring words, for someone who's going through some, even a small comparable loss to this. So anyway, it's, to me, that's also important to show that, this, even though this is such a monumental tragedy, it did not destroy this family. It made them stronger in a lot of ways, and I think that's very inspiring.
Let's talk about the funeral. Animal, I think, did a shoot interview years ago where he said there were no less than 200 limos, and a lot of people have even equated it to almost like the passing of a president. I mean, there were more than 1,000 folks outside, and they've got a PA system. Obviously, it's a packed house inside. Everyone wants to pay their respects, but I think it's around this time when Martha promises a day of reckoning. And of course she gets that somewhat. I think she sued for 35 million. WWE offered 17. They countered back with 18, and it was done. And that's acknowledged that it was an $18 million settlement. And I think what a lot of fans may not realize is WWE recovered some of those costs from the rigging company, right, Evan?
I believe so. I honestly, I don't know. I don't know a ton about that, to be honest with you. But with that settlement, I mean, one of the things is that Martha, like she says in the episode, she really wanted this to go to trial. You know, I think she was probably looking at more criminal charges than she was a settlement. And one thing about the settlement too, is that, a lot of that money, went to setting up the Owen Hart Foundation. And I know also a lot of it went to the Hart family as well, not just to Martha's family. And that's something in terms of, what happened in the wake of this tragedy. But yeah, just wild.
Let's, I guess we can't really talk about the story without at least acknowledging that I don't know how this happened, but McDivitt, the WWE's attorney, who I think most people would agree is, perhaps the perfect attorney for WWE. It feels like he's gotten them out of a lot of jams and navigated some very difficult waters. And, other people would probably describe him as a brilliant attorney, but perhaps he was the world's worst PR man this week. He did an interview with, CBS Sports and others. I think he's done something with Sports Illustrated and a few others, but there are some pretty pointed comments out there from him now that really caught me off guard. And, there's so many sort of layers to this onion. Like, I don't know if you guys kept up with what was happening on Twitter last night, but there was a ton of folks saying, hey, why didn't you guys interview the Harts? Why was Bret Hart not participating in this? What about the rest of the Hart family? But one of the things touched on, even in the documentary, is from Jim Cornette. He says, you have to appreciate this is a wrestling family. Everyone in this family made their living in wrestling. And here's a guy, the most powerful man in wrestling, who at different points has employed a large percentage of this family's livelihood. And you now want him to sort of alienate the rest of their future opportunities, perhaps. So out of self-preservation, maybe some of the Harts weren't interested in doing that. And of course, Jerry McDivitt would say in these more recent comments that Martha was angling for, hey, if you are on my side and we can gang up on Vince, then if there's a big settlement, you'll participate. It's such a murky thing with the Hart family and this lawsuit against Vince. I'm curious what you think the fallout of the lawsuit is. I mean, do you guys know what the status of the relation? It feels like when we read comments from Bret Hart that he's not on the best of terms with Martha. Do you know what that looks like for the rest of the family's perspective, Evan?
Yeah. I mean, the relationship between, Martha and the rest of the Hart family is strained. I think it's another one of the tragedies of the story is that, that this really tore that family apart in a lot of ways. I mean, Stu and Helen, it was awful for them, obviously. And I think that, from Martha's point of view, and something that she's written about and talked about, is that, from her perspective, when the WWE didn't really have much of a case during the lawsuit, that their influence again, with the rest of the Hart family and the fact that they have employed so many of them, really kind of, I think, muddied the waters with the relationship that everyone had there. And of course, you're talking about a lot of different folks in the family and the way that they've been employed previously. And so it's a very complicated situation that you're dealing with. And I think, for her, when she's, as we touched on in the episode, when members of the Hart family had actually taken Martha's legal documents and faxed them to the defense, she took that as a stab in the back. That was a move against Owen, I think it's been very hard for those wounds to heal. I think the situation between her and Brett is more complicated. It's an unfortunate thing, but Martha was not against Brett being involved in this episode. It's just literally the fact that Brett didn't return any of our emails or phone calls to be a part of this episode. And we've talked about it before. Brett wasn't thrilled about our episode on the Montreal screw job, so maybe that played into it. I don't know. But it wasn't like, these were parameters or places we couldn't go with the story. It just literally was, we wanted to, of course, show that side to the story. But, this is mostly the story of Martha and her family, and I think it's just a whole nother separate tragedy of what happened in the rift between Owen's, family and the Hart family.
Yeah, it is one of the unfortunate situations here. I guess we should at least ask, was there any interest or did you guys pursue any conversations with the Hart family or Brett in participating in this documentary, or did you not feel it was necessary just based on the fact that you had, folks who were there ringside, and more importantly, from a family perspective, who better than perhaps his wife, son, and daughter?
Yeah. It was, again, you could only interview so many people just by virtue of our time and budget and everything. But, Brett was definitely someone that we wanted to interview for the episode, of course, to talk about, his brother and coming up through the ranks and everything that's happened from beginning and middle and to the end of the tragedy. And of course, Brett's perspective on Owen's legacy differs from Martha's. And of course, we would have loved to have included that. So we did actively pursue Brett for this episode. It just, he just didn't get back to us.
Let's talk a little bit about the comments from Jerry McDivitt this week. He says, Martha was not even remotely interested in finding out what happened that night. She just wanted to use it as a vehicle to beat up a business that she didn't like that her husband was in, the wrestling business. And then we see in the documentary that not only did she pursue what did happen that night, but she went so far as to go to the building and go up on the catwalk, not just herself, but with her kids. Oj talks about looking over the ledge and thinking about what must have been going through his dad's mind. And this is when he's still a young boy. That does not seem like a woman who's not interested in finding out what happened that night. Would you agree, Jason?
Yeah, that definitely, when we heard that story from Oj's perspective of his mom taking him to the arena to retrace his father's last steps, it was just, that was so powerful. And also, it was really interesting because, the way she guided her kids through the grieving process of losing her father was really interesting. At first it's kind of shocking to hear all these kids went there and they got up on the scaffolding to see it. But for Oj, it meant a lot because for him it would lead. He felt like and Martha knew this too, that if they had any questions about it, or if they were just haunted by, what their father had gone through, at least they could see it for themselves and see it all visually and be able to process it, throughout the years, probably in a better way than having a lot of doubt about those visuals. And so I remember when Oj walked us through that left such an impression on me. And I just knew man, people are going to find that aspect of it so inspiring in a way, and how to deal with grief over a loved one. That was,
I couldn't believe it, because that was a part of the story that I did not know going into this. Even after the anniversary articles and the podcasts from last year, I didn't know that, she retraced his steps. And actually, it's kind of condensed in the episode, but she would go back a couple of different times. She went back there with her attorneys at first to look at it and to see for herself and retrace those steps. And again, just horrified at the height in which we're talking about. Even that photograph that's in the show where it's just that the one police photo where it's looking directly down at the ring, that's actually from the scoreboard. That's not even all the way from the rafters is for how high we're actually talking here. And then she would go back, and then there was another time where she went back to Kansas City and brought her children there and had that moment to where she showed, what were her, what their father's last moments, where that took place. And I just couldn't believe it. And again, like those comments from yesterday, I mean, it's clearly very it's clearly aimed at misdirecting really from what, this whole story is about. And it just shows you, how, deep this goes in terms of how the perspective and that's really something, where obviously, the WWE and the company and everything, there's such a, they've kind of controlled, I feel like, this narrative for such a long time, and including myself as a wrestling fan who's grown up, for a long time. I subscribe to the belief, just based on what's been out there, that, this is just an unfortunate freak accident. But when you really look at all the information that goes into this, and I'm talking about just everything leading up to, from a creative standpoint, to when this actually took place, to the aftermath, to how it was handled. You see that clip of Vince McMahon and just how this was handled, and especially with Martha and everything. It's just, that perspective has just feeling like so suppressed. Like you would have to have really been someone that actually sought after her book, read it, and then really known that story. And so I think this is an important part of, wrestling history that, needs to be told. And that was what we felt like what was important in sharing it.
Well, I'm really glad that all of this is coming to light, especially, we touched on it at the beginning of the episode here today. Maybe the way fans viewed Martha before, the last week or so, and maybe the way they look at her now, especially with regards to the WWE Hall of Fame. And I feel like, JR's comment about, hey, if a guy like me is in the Hall of Fame, Owen Hart should be in 10 Halls of Fame, or 10 Hall of Fames. And Martha's not going to let that happen. And I understand it. And I'm glad that she's sort of taken the stand that she has. And I'm also glad that she's recently reached a deal with Pro Wrestling Tees, and now there's official Owen Hart t-shirts and merchandise for the first time in more than 2 decades. And it all goes to the Owen Hart Foundation, which we touched on a little bit in the documentary. Jason, what can you tell us about the Owen Hart Foundation and the good they're doing now?
Well, yeah, it's, you see a lot of, people, saying that, she should allow for the WWE to put him in the Hall of Fame and honor him in that way. But I think it's very narrow-minded to just think that that's the only way to honor Owen and his legacy. And, there are other wrestling Hall of Fames, and the way that his family have honored his legacy is incredible. Like, I don't know of anyone, or any other wrestler whose life has been honored the way that Martha and her family have with the Owen Hart Foundation. They have put like so many kids through school, built homes, and helped, single mothers. And they've done so much to continue the legacy of Owen Hart. It might not be with the WWE, but they've been doing it like so much elsewhere. And there's so many people who are learning about Owen Hart, like just outside of the wrestling world. Like he was so much bigger than just wrestling, and as you could see, even from the funeral footage, from his, in Calgary, like, the Hart family here in Canada, you got the royal family and you got the Hart family, and, Canada really like celebrated, the Hart family and, Owen, and, loved him. And so I think it's incredible to see how like they've continued his legacy and with the Owen Hart Foundation. It's remarkable. You know, they work on it every single day.
I think the thing that's like, you know, it's the thing that really you know, frustrates me in terms of this story is, you know, because obviously, you know, we post a ton of stuff on social media, and I knew this was going to be a hotbed, you know, when we started promoting this episode and posting photos and talking about it, to where you really see that there is this subsect of fans who really feel entitled, that, you know, she should just, you know, bury the hatchet, and, you know, this is how she should grieve, and this is what she should do, and, you know, and all this stuff. And it's so bizarre. It's such a bizarre mindset. But I really think it's mostly based on ignorance, obviously, to the details of the story, which is one of the main reasons why we wanted to do it. But the other thing that to me is I feel that there's a narrative, and now we're clearly seeing that it's a narrative that's being perpetuated by the WWE. We just, you know, with Jerry McDevitt's comments from a few days ago, which is this idea that, you know, this is kind of the fake news aspect of the story, if you will, is that, you know, Martha is not the type of, like, she's being painted as a person who wants to bury his wrestling legacy, you know, and that's the part of it that people are holding on to, that, and even Brett kind of a little bit like has subscribed to that too, which is not the case, you know. It's just that, and I think Jim Cornette puts it perfectly in the episode where he says that, you know, Martha just does not want the company that she feels is responsible for her husband's death to continue to profit off his name. And I think that is a pretty clear-cut, simple thing to understand, you know. But I think for a lot of people, and myself included, you know, going into this story before last year, you know, I may have entertained that because I didn't really know that, you know, this isn't just a freak accident. There's something much more here, you know, and so, which is very provable, and it was provable in the court of law at the time, or not in the court of law because it was a settlement, but you know what I mean? Like, there's enough evidence there to like deduce that. And I think that it's just really unfair for fans to feel like, and this is my personal opinion, you know, to feel like, you know, she should do, you know, this for, you know, with the WWE or that or da-da-da. You know, I think it's completely Martha's decision. And, you know, I think it's kind of ludicrous to expect that she should do, she should go against what her strongest, you know, feeling has been this whole, you know, like from the very beginning, you know. So, yeah, seeing those comments it definitely irks me on a personal level.
Yeah, especially when you talk about the Brett thing, you know, and obviously I know that every family has, you know, their ups and downs, but it always happens behind closed doors. But now it's sort of more in public. And, you know, in the CBS story, Martha was quoted as saying, "At the end of it all, I've forgiven them all, really. The Hart family, Vince McMahon. I don't hold any grudges. I hope life has been kind to all of them. My life hasn't been easy, but I certainly wouldn't wish harm on them." And about the relationship with the family, she says, "I don't have a relationship with the rest of the Hart family. That said, if I see them on the street or at an event, I'm always polite. I tell my kids to be polite and respectful. But the problem is, once you break the trust in a relationship, I'm really sad that they couldn't find the strength to support me. It's unfortunate that they put their own self-interest above the welfare of me and my kids and getting justice for Owen, but it can't be changed. So it is what it is." And, it's a shame because, you know, you feel like, man, how could this be any worse? And then to know, well, then there's no family support either. I mean, so Oj and his sister, of course, grew up without some of the closeness that a lot of the other Hart family children would have enjoyed. And that to me, while it's not touched on a ton in the documentary for the sake of time and everything else, is almost like the worst, you know, epilogue ever to the whole story. But
yeah,
the now that we're on we're wrapping it up here. Season 2's done. This is the finale. Before we talk about the rumor and innuendo about what might be next, I do want to bring up what was the talk of Twitter last night. And a lot of people were saying Vince is evil, Vince is scum, Vince is shit, whatever. And a lot of people were sort of high-fiving you guys for not being quote unquote scared of Vince McMahon. And a lot of folks in wrestling don't want to come out and say something too pointed about Vince McMahon for fear of self-preservation. But obviously you guys don't have any sort of delusions of wanting to work with WWE, but you guys have been applauded for sort of taking Vince to task. And even in the episode that we saw last night, there's a clip of Vince at a press conference saying, "I resent your tone, lady." And that comes off really rough. And some defenders of Vince would argue, well, that was taken out of context. I'm curious, Evan, after you've done 2 seasons of this now, what do you think of Vince McMahon? Do you think he is some evil person? Are there shades of gray? I mean, obviously this is a tough spot he's in when, as you said earlier, this is an unprecedented moment. Nobody knows exactly what to do. Clearly, with the benefit of hindsight, everyone agrees, well, that was a fucking mistake to continue the show. But then in the CBS article, we see a quote from Jerry that says, Vince told her right there, "Look, Martha, I feel so bad for what happened. I feel responsible because this happened on my watch. I want to take care of you and your family. I loved Owen. He was almost crying, and we offered $17 million to take care of her. How many times does a CEO walk in a room and say he feels responsible? I'm not going to argue, quote, I just feel responsible for what happened." And then they turn it down. And of course we know that they wound up settling for $1 million extra the next day, $18 million. But McDivitt is saying, hey, Vince took this on the chin and owned it and said, "Hey, I fucked up. I take responsibility. And this obviously was an accident. No one would have ever intentionally caused Owen to lose his life." But
Right.
the perception of Vince through your series is not always the best look for Vince. Where do you land on Vince, Evan?
Well, I mean, it's incredibly complicated. I mean, it's hard to deny, I think, when you're looking back, in history with all these different stories that we've covered, there is kind of a tangible callousness, I think, that is there, in terms of a guy who's, excuse the pun, wrestling with the idea of, being a businessman, a very successful businessman, a guy who's taken an industry from, small, VFW bingo halls, across the country to the mainstream global entertainment, phenomenon that it's been. And there's a lot of, respect that goes into that. But I mean, there's hard to deny some decisions that have been made over the course of the years that, here and there. I mean, I obviously grew up as a fan of the WWE's product and still am in some ways. But there is a complicated past, and I think that, you can't, it's hard to not touch on some of that, when you're doing a show that's called Dark Side of the Ring. But to me, the ultimate goal would be in some way, and someday, I don't know if it's ever going to be a possibility, but would be like, let's do the interview with Vince, let's do the Vince McMahon episode. I would do it in a heartbeat, absolutely.
Jason, what about you? What do you think? Is Vince this evil person that people on Twitter are saying he is? Do you see there's more shades of gray? It's more complicated than that. Where do you land on Vince?
Yeah, I'm pretty much on the same page as Evan. There was never any aspect of the show where we, were setting out to, highlight, Vince's, darker moments. But, there's growing up, as such a huge fan of wrestling, and even Vince himself as an entertainer is, you can't deny is unbelievable. Just like his own performances as well. So yeah, you struggle a little bit just with, there's a part of you that has admired what he's done, in the business, and as an entertainer. But there are these aspects to his life and decisions that he has made that, that has made me, I guess, I don't know. I don't necessarily dwell on how I feel about him necessarily. It's just, he's just a part of all these stories, and all these stories that we really want to tell. He's a really big aspect of.
Yeah. it's kind of, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's also kind of like, it's interesting that it always kind of comes back to him in some way. Even when we set out to do an episode, like, I was thinking, like, I think he's almost in every episode of the show this season, and it's not necessarily by a conscious decision. It's like, even like, okay, we're doing an episode about Herb Abrams and the UWF, but all of a sudden, Vince somehow is in the picture,
right?
And it just kind of all goes back to Vince. I mean, he is wrestling. At the end of the day, it's like, we all may think that Hulk Hogan is the Mount Rushmore guy at the end of the day, but it's really Vince McMahon. I mean, he's really the guy that is the center point of all of this. Without Vince McMahon, we probably wouldn't be talking about wrestling today, or it wouldn't nearly be what it is today. So he is the person that no matter if anything controversial happens or if anything major happens, he's the person that everyone associates. He's the name. He's the decision maker. He's the big force behind this. So no matter in any time when you tell a wrestling story, in some way or another, Vince is going to pop up, and but I think the true story of Vince McMahon, his, coming up into this business, coming through it, everything that he's ever seen, that would be the most fascinating, 20-part documentary series that, would probably ever exist, in terms of every story in this landscape that he's touched, and every family and every, every wrestler and their career and their trajectory. This guy has had a power of influence over a ton of people, and is responsible for a lot. And so it's a compelling story, but there's no way to really dive into the world of wrestling without, especially the controversial side, without him to be interwoven throughout it, just by the nature of the stories.
Yeah, I mean, just because, as you said, I mean, he has been sort of the puppeteer for wrestling for so long, and it's important to remind everyone listening to this that real life is not wrestling. I know that sounds silly, but no one is a quote unquote baby face or a quote unquote heel in real life.
Right.
There are positives and negatives with every personality and every person that's ever walked Earth. And Vince is one of those guys where there are a lot of good things I'm sure that Vince McMahon has done, but this is not called the good side of the ring. This is the dark side of the ring. And so we're going to gravitate towards the negative things that have happened. And
right.
There's the old phrase, the buck stops here. Well, he's sort of the Roger Goodell, if you will, of the NFL. And, I look at how many players former players in the NFL are suffering from CTE and will continue to. I mean, it's going to be unanimous one day that, more than 90% of those players wind up with it. It's just the nature of that business and the beast. And I think a lot of that sort of rests on the shoulders of Vince McMahon from a WWE side, because I mean, when we talk about a Hall of Fame, I think the most legitimate wrestling Hall of Fame is the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. And of course, my buddy Bruce Pritchard would probably take issue with that, but that is more than just one guy saying, hey, he's in or he's out. There's more of, the more realistic approach where you're asking former wrestlers and journalists and experts and things like that, their opinion. But for right or wrong, Vince McMahon, for as long as I can remember, has sort of been the purveyor of wrestling history. So he's going to be a critical part of all these stories because all of that sort of lands on his shoulders. But I do think that the big takeaway from this last night, especially as I scrolled through Twitter, was just overwhelming anger at Vince about, oh, he's terrible and he's this and he's that. But that's sort of the nature of the show. And I feel like I'm saying all that to say, you're probably not going to get a Christmas card from Vince this year, Jason. Would you agree?
I guess not. But like I said, I'm ready for, for the Vince McMahon, episode, or the Vince McMahon docuseries. So, absolutely. Would be fascinated to talk to him and to get his side of the story.
Have you guys
of these stories?
Have you guys had any pushback from WWE? Like, have they sent you any cease and desist letters or any sort of negative, anything like that you know of?
No, not that I know of. No.
What can we expect, Jason? Are you guys hoping to do a season 3? And if so, what topics might you want to cover?
Well, it's hard to say, as we always say in a lot of ways, but yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I don't know what's going to happen with the season 3 yet. It's something Evan and I have talked a lot about. There's you could easily do a season 3. There are a lot of other stories that we would love to tell. But at the same time, too, I think, we've just made 16 like documentaries, and we put so much into each and every one of these episodes. It's like one of our babies, and we put so much into it, and it takes a lot out of us to do it. And so I'm like, I don't know what lies for season 3, but I'm so proud of the work that we've done on season 1 and season 2. And then, just even last night was kind of like the first time I felt like I could just have a really clear, perspective, or just I felt like I could just take a huge weight lifted off my shoulders with the season finale happening, because it's literally from the announcement, even before the announcements of season 2, we've worked on this show every single day, and it has consumed our lives 24/7. And so I don't know. We'll see what happens with the season 3 and what Vice thinks of the show, and but you never know. But if this was it, I'm also really proud of what we've done.
Yeah, it kind of feels like last night was kind of the first time in 3 years I feel like I was able to exhale a little bit, in terms of it's just been kind of nonstop for us in a lot of ways.
Is that bittersweet?
What's that?
Where on the one hand you feel like, man, I'm so glad that these came off, and I'm so proud of what we did, and I've got some of this pressure off of me. But at the same time, is it also okay, it was a lot of work, but I was really having fun, and I wish I could do more? Is it bittersweet like that?
Well, I mean, look, it's been a tough show to make, honestly, in a lot of ways, and it's taken a lot out of us. It's a lot of travel in a very, very, very short amount of time, and and there's a lot of concessions that have to be made on the fly, and you have to earn the trust of a lot of folks in a short amount of time because you have a schedule you're beholden to, and it's very complicated in terms of I mean, at anytime we're working on a season, we're working on all the episodes at the same exact time. There's no time where we're like, okay, we do one and we do the next one, we do that, And so for us, it's just been this mad dash almost since 2017, I feel like, where it's just literally, as soon as season 1 was done airing, we were out the door to do season 2. So, if a season 3 happens, which I'm not saying it's not, or, whatever, obviously there's this global crisis going on right now. So I don't even know when the soonest that we can actually safely get on this amount of airplanes and go into a certain amount of people's homes and interview them and, go into a studio and shoot reenactments and everything. So who knows? Maybe this time that, where the whole world's on pause, maybe will give us that time to rest up and to go to go march into another season. I mean, there's no shortage of stories. That's the one thing. I mean, there's tons of different areas to explore in wrestling. And we would love to. I mean, it's a huge part of our lives. It always has been. And doing this show has been a dream too, because even though it is dark side of the ring and we are exploring these tragic stories and the darker side of the business, there's still a love that Jason and I have for the business. I mean, every single day we're passing, by when someone on social media posts a rare photo, or, when, we get the hankering to order some Hasbros on eBay or whatever, that's stuff that we do all the time. And so, we definitely have our love and passion for the industry, and, we want that to continue and to grow, and who knows, maybe it'll turn into something completely different. It'll be another wrestling related project from us that,
Yeah, that's something we like when we got into this, into the show, we were just obsessed with wanting to just do tell us these stories in the wrestling world. And at first, we thought it would be a narrative scripted series, something like The Sopranos, meets Boogie Nights, but in the world of world class championship wrestling or during that era. And when we tried to pitch that like that show to Hollywood, it just would literally just go over everyone's heads. And
Yeah.
but we were just so obsessed with all the research we had been doing, and just like we really felt like we needed to like find an outlet for it. And so when we were able to convince Vice to do the show, it has been this kind of like, like a dream come true in a lot of ways, because we just get to like, hear from a lot of people we grew up loving, and hearing, this like perspective that we've never heard before. And like, it's addicting. And we got to say too, like Conrad, like when we got into this, like, and what was it, 2016 or 2017, like your show, like Something to Wrestle With, was like such a huge inspiration in a way. And especially because like, it like for us, like I think it showed like, oh, there's other people out there like yourself that like have the same like fascination and a desire to like seek out these stories, and just the audience that you were gathering showed us like, oh, there's an audience for this too. Like there are people who are really fascinated and want to know these like stories, and the way that you went about like telling them and doing your interviews, really like you do it in such a way that just pulls these stories out of your subjects, that like you could just sit there and we would, like when we were on the road, like we would just listen to your podcast.
We did.
And we'd be traveling like, hours and hours just on the road, and like you could sit back and really like visualize it. Like I just felt like the way you guys got the stories out, like I could just vision it. Like it was playing all out like a movie, like in my head. And that was really inspiring. So I got to thank you like so much for that.
No, man, listen, it's a mutual admiration society. I'll never forget when you guys invited Bruce and I to the Vice HQ there in New York to screen the Bruiser Brody episode before it was finalized, of course. But my gosh, I'd never seen anything like it. And I'm so excited that we got to see 2 seasons of it. And I hope this isn't the end. And I hope that, you guys continue to create content like this. And I hope there is a season 3, but Evan, if this is it, do you want to give some special thanks and shout outs to some of the unsung heroes behind the scenes? I mean, we're talking to you and Jason every week, but this is not a 2-man show.
Yeah.
There's a huge cast and crew that you guys really relied on a lot here that I'm sure you'd like to give a little props to.
Absolutely. There's been tons of folks that have worked across, just season 2 or both seasons. And that have helped to make this show possible, for sure. We've mentioned him a few times on the show. Alex McIntosh was our series producer for season 2, and he held us together, and I think in a lot of ways. And because we were just spread so thin and are wound so tight sometimes, in terms of trying to get the show done. I think he really helped balance the needs of delivering this show while also trying to preserve our creative vision. And I can't thank him enough. Howard Sheffman, who was on this podcast, Howard's been with us since season 1, and an incredible researcher, incredible mind. And passion for the business, passion for the show. He's someone we know we can rely on all the time, and he's put so much into this show from season 1 and season 2. Jessica Joy Wise was another story producer along with Howard on this season, and she did an incredible job. Worked on the other half of the episodes that Howard did not, and they both did a fantastic job in terms of research and putting this together for us in a lot of ways. Our editors, Jason Cook, who edited the Chris Benoit episode along with the Owen Hart episode. He was a vital part of it. Jason, who else we got?
We got Clark Masters, who was our editor on the Dino Bravo episode and the New Jack episode and the Road Warriors episode. We got Emily Wilson, who edited the Brawl for All and the Snuka story and the David Schultz story. We've got Andy Appel, who was our cinematographer on the show, who was such an incredible collaborator.
Yeah.
So much to it.
Yeah. Andy was like was so great to work with. And Andy, he came aboard season 2 kind of not in the middle of it, but like I think 1/4 of the way through it, and he just did such an amazing job, and grew up as a fan, and he really got into the trenches with us on this show, and and always bringing new ideas, which is so cool. And I remember he showing up to the reenactment sets like with a suitcase full of like gems, and we started filming through gems and diamonds and bringing really cool, interesting new visual looks to the reenactments this season, which was awesome. So Andy is amazing.
Yeah, and our camera assistant Dan Tamazan, who
Tamizian, Jason.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, he brought so much to it too, and Adam Burke, our sound recordist, who was on the road with us the whole time. We got Mike Schultz, our story editor, on the Benoit episode and the David Schultz episode.
Jeff Sturge was another story editor.
Jeff Sturge.
Andrew
Gordon McPherson and Wade McNeil, who did all the music for us. And, the music is such a huge part of our show. And those guys, I just owe them so much to it, because we just had such big aspirations for the music for the seasons, and they just over-delivered for us and brought so much passion to it. And they threw their lives into it as well. So big ups to them. Cool.
Just for the record, they composed 159 different cues and tracks, like songs, for this entire 2 seasons, which is now going to be immortalized in a brand new soundtrack release, which we're doing with Waxworks Records. And it's actually going to be released on a deluxe 180-gram 2 vinyl set that you can pre-order now on waxworksrecords.com. And it's also the soundtrack, the best of their 159 cues, is available to stream right now on Apple Music and Spotify or wherever else you listen to music. Those guys, we owe them the world. And it's like without their music, I think our show just becomes a regular talking head documentary show.
It was remarkable, and I hope this isn't the end. But if it is, Evan, what's next for you? We common folk who go clock in and clock out at our boring mortgage job every day. We don't know how you fancy Hollywood types go job to job or project to project. Tell us what we could expect from you in the future, if you have anything cooking, or what's next for you.
Well, Jason and I work pretty closely together, and we have a lot of different projects and documentary stuff, but also some feature length scripted things that we'd love to get made that we've wanted to do for a long time. And of course, this show. I mean, we're not saying no to season 3. Of course, that is still a very, very, very big possibility. But one thing I did want to say when we were talking about, when we were talking about wanting to do a scripted version of this show, when we were pitching that to Hollywood, 3 or 4 years ago, and just seeing how this went over all the executives' heads, there was no appreciation for wrestling. And it's kind of felt like Dark Side of the Ring has been this big crusade to prove to network executives, to entertainment industry folks, that, wrestling can not only just draw an audience. I mean, that's been proven for a long time, but that wrestling is a breeding ground of fascinating human stories, no matter what, dark or otherwise. And I feel like this whole journey for us over the last 3 years has been to prove that, whether it's to those people I was talking about, or to Vice itself, or to anyone. And so for us, it's like, there have been some scripted projects of wild and insane stories we've heard on this journey that we would love to turn into a TV show, or love to turn into another movie, or into something else, And so, I wouldn't, so there is a possibility for that, because after doing the show for so long, I mean, we've kind of hit on this formula for it, but I feel like there's so many other ways that we can, kind of expand upon, if you will, this world, because I think there's even more left to dig into and more nuance. So that's also a possibility. I wouldn't hold that out either.
Well, tell everybody how we can keep up with what's going on with you guys for what's next. I know I tried to throw the handle pitch to Jason once and he fumbled. So I'll go back to Evan here. Evan, what are your and Jason's handles? We know what the dark side ones are, but so we can keep up with what you guys are doing when season 2 is sort of in the rearview mirror. What are the handles for you guys?
All right. So you can keep up with Jason on Twitter and Instagram at Jason Eisener. And it's very important that you spell his last name correctly because nobody really does. It's Eisener for the Eisener. So at Jason Eisener for both Instagram and Twitter. And I'm at Evan Husney. Husney, and please don't spell my name Even because I can't believe people think my name is Even, but most people do in the Starbucks line. And Paul Bunyan too, when I was a kid, called me Even, and it made me very upset. Okay, so at Evan Husney for Twitter and Instagram, and yeah, follow us. And now that season 2 is in the rearview mirror, we are going to be unloading some more behind the scenes moments. Hopefully some more clips from the show that didn't make air and some other things. And of course, hopefully other opportunities like the soundtrack and other merchandise will be hitting. And, hopefully we can just grow this thing and always send us your ideas. We're never going to turn down hearing season 3 ideas. I'm sure we'll do a big social media post. I actually want to try and figure out a way, if there is a season 3, I kind of want to figure out a way to put out let's do a big poll. I want to find the right web software, that because I don't want to literally last year I counted every single suggestion that people sent in, which is absurd. So I want to try and find some way where everyone can meet at one website and vote for what topics they would actually like to see in a season 3, because that really helped us going into season 2. And if we do a season 3 with Vice, we'd love to make sure that, we, at least for a handful of the episodes or majority of them, show you what you guys really want to see.
Well, I'm excited. I hope that there is a season 3. I know I've emailed you both my fantasy wish list of
great list, by the way. List.
I hope that we can do this. And I even read something last week that I thought was so absurd that I called Evan. I never call Evan. I text Evan and I called him and said, dude, if you do a season 3, you got to do this. And I don't want to give a spoiler because maybe season 3 won't even happen, but I hope it does because this has just been so much fun. And by the way, we have had some requests. Hey, are you guys going to do a podcast about season 1? And I guess I should give a peek behind the curtain. The guys and I have agreed that if there is a season 3, to sort of get us ramped up and in the mood for that season 3, the weeks leading up to season 3, we'll go ahead and push out recaps and discussions about season 1. So stay tuned. If Dark Side of the Ring comes back for season 3, Dark Side of the Pod will be right there. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate you guys allowing us the opportunity to do this and doing it every single week like this. I know that for today maybe is different, but every other time we've talked, you guys were like, okay, we got to go work on the next week. And so it was a lot of pressure every week. And I appreciate you taking the time and doing it with me every week.
Oh, thank you so much, Conrad. It's been amazing. And thanks for taking the time to do this with us. It's, it means a lot for us to be able to kind of, just kind of talk about these episodes, after, they've aired and just kind of, get everything off our chest about them too. So I really appreciate you doing that.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, cause when you send something out into the world, it's like you like every time I've ever emailed somebody a link to the episode, like before it's aired or like shown it to people or screened it for people, I always am the guy that stands up and gives the 10 caveats, before you actually sit down and watch it. So it's really nerve-wracking for us to kind of send this out into the world and know how many people are watching without being able to have that opportunity of being able to say all the things that you want to say in context and before or after people watch it. And so having this opportunity to do that has been awesome, and to be able to dive into the show and tell all the wacky, weird stories that we've come across, and in this wild journey, and especially now that it's something I'll be able to remember. So now when I forget all of this, 5 to 10 years from now, I can go back and we can listen to these episodes and I can reminisce about all of the things that we've seen. I
do want to briefly mention before we wrap things up that Well, I would say we, but specifically me. I was pretty hard on the after show with Chris Gethard after the Snuka episode, and I realized, this has been a weird time for all of us this year with the pandemic, and things are way different. So instead of it being a studio show, it was more of a Zoom show, like all of our news and everything else is right now. But that show in particular, I just thought was, not good. And I was pretty vocal about it here on the show. I do want to say that I stockpiled all of those episodes since, and I watched them this week, and it is a much, much better show. So if you sort of gave up on the after show with Chris Gethard, go take a look at it. There are going to be some replays here and there, and I would encourage you to go pick them up. Go out of your way to see them. There's a lot of deleted clips that you wouldn't have normally seen through the course of the episode. And maybe we were unfair. Maybe at the same time, it was bad timing. They're trying to make chicken salad a little bit, and they were trying to do it right after. Now with the delay, instead of it airing right after the show, and instead now they've given themselves a week to put it together. I think it is a very nice companion piece. And if I was negative about that, I want to let everybody listening who sort of maybe agreed with me and maybe gave up on it, go take another look. It's worth another look. All those episodes sort of post Snuka, when they switched from airing right after to a week later, much improved. And I'm sure you guys agree.
Oh yeah. And it's been really cool, to see, some cool faces on there as well. I mean, the David Schultz one I thought was really entertaining. Getting Dutch Mantel, our old buddy, on there, Ricky Morton, and having them talk about the business back in those days was really cool. I also have seen the Owen one that's going to be next week, and there's a fellow on there that would have been really cool for us to interview for the episode. He was a journalist that was actually there the night of. Yeah, I mean, those guys had it was a bold thing to put that show together at the last minute. They had this idea literally weeks before we were going to premiere the Chris Benoit episode, and so they really put this thing together last minute. We were unfortunately too busy with Dark Side of the Ring and delivering the final episodes to really be involved in that show, or to even appear on it. So it was for them, it was just wanting to deliver more content and wanting to being able to kind of do what we do here and expand upon the episodes. It's just, they had a lot of limitations in terms of what they could do in time and everything. But, I have to agree with you that in the last handful of episodes that I've seen, I feel like they've definitely been doing a good job.
Yeah, much improved. Go check it out if you haven't already, and be sure to follow these guys on Twitter. I can't wait to see what's next, and we appreciate you guys tuning in every single week and keeping up with us, and we're going to keep this momentum going, hopefully, for season 3. And be sure to follow their official Dark Side of the Ring accounts. Evan, do you want to run those down one last time, so if there is an update, they'll know when and where to find it?
Oh yeah. That is at Dark Side of Ring on Twitter and at Dark Side of the Ring on Instagram. And give us a follow. We got more things to share from season 1 even and season 2. Things like the soundtrack that's coming out. And we're doing a whole new line of Dark Side of the Ring shirts that we're going to be doing with Pro Wrestling Tees. We just got started doing that. So you can get the Dark Side of the Ring shirt, hoodie, which I'm going to be wearing, and a few other things, and as well. And then we're going to be doing other partnerships with other families to do other shirts to give back for basically allowing us to tell their stories and to have them and for letting us collaborate with them. So stay tuned for all those cool things that we're going to be dropping and announcing from here on out.
And thank you guys for checking us out here every single week on Grillin' JR. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. Leave us a 5-star review if you think we've earned it. And be sure to tune in next week for more, or actually tomorrow. I forget, man. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We got another great Grillin' JR tomorrow. And then in 8 days, we'll be back again every single Thursday here on Westwood One. And hopefully soon, you'll have a little surprise on a Wednesday. Dark Side of the Pod coming back. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Talk to you soon. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And go save yourself some money right now. If you're in a 30-year loan or you have credit card debt, it's not a matter of if I can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com.